Hello, my name is Ethan Swenson, and this is my AP research presentation on sleep deprivation. So, contrary to what many believe, time of when we are sleeping is actually one of the most productive times of our human presence and our human bodies. As when we are asleep, our brain is actually in its most active state, as this is when it performs a lot of the essential bodily processes that not only replenish our body, but also prepare our body for the next day ahead. And about a third of our entire life is spent sleeping, which equates to about 9,500 days. And as explained by research assistant Erica Jansen of the University of Michigan, sleep is essential to every process in the body as it affects our physical and mental functioning for the next day, our immunity, our metabolism, and our chronic disease risk. And as presented by Stanford University, about 87% of high school teenagers and of the teenage age are affected badly by sleep deprivation. And this shows that it is a pandemic in its own, and it has not only increased with the pandemic of COVID-19, but also because of the increased use and the widespread availability of technology and devices that emit blue light. And some things that cause people to stay up later and have insomnia and increase their risk of sleep deprivation are eating right before bed, large meals, exercising, staying up to do schoolwork, and also staying up to do work outside of school. And all these things lead them to stay up later and later while still having to get up at a certain early time, which leads them to be sleep deprived and not get the recommended 8 to 10 hours of sleep. And for the literature review, the first article and study that I researched was by Shoham Hillel of the School of Business Administration at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he measured the cognitive effects of one night of sleep deprivation on medical students and medical residents. And he performed 2 tests on the students, or had them take 2 tests, one baseline and one test after 26 hours of sleep deprivation. And he used a control group of students who were not sleep deprived, and then one group of 33 students who performed a 26-hour shift. And the measures that he used include computerized tests, as well as a Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. And the results was that their chronic sleep curtailment was associated with greater impulsivity, slower cognitive processing, and overall decreased executive function. And this can be compared to my study because my participants were students and those who are currently within their academic year, and I'm looking at GPA, which is cumulative of their entire high school experience, ranging from 1 to 4 years. And my second study is by Paola Garab-Chahin of the ABC Medical Center in Mexico, and she also looked at the cognitive effect of sleep deprivation, but she looked at its effect on essential neurophysical tests, including executive function, such as selective attention, their control, and their processing velocity. She used the Stroop test, which is also a well-known test involving the sleep index and the executive function. And her results were that chronic sleep deprivation caused an alteration in selective attention, working memory, and processing speed. And this also relates to my study as well, as her participants were students as well. But one thing that is different than these first 2 studies from my study is that they were over one period of a certain amount of time, while my study kind of fills in this gap and is cumulative from 1 to 4 years, as I said, as the respondents their GPAs range from a time span of 1 year for freshmen and 4 years to seniors. And the final study was by Patrick Youssef of the Imperial College School of Medicine in London, and his participants were randomized into two conditions: normal sleep or 1 night of sleep deprivation. And he tested working memory, executive function, and physical reaction time. And his conclusion was that acute sleep deprivation had a significant effect on post-exercise blood pressure and reaction time in students. And he concluded that although these results can be effective in showing the effects of sleep deprivation, he concluded that a study of longevity over time would better show these effects, and this particularly relates to my study as it is cumulative of years, and for some months, but for most of them, multiple years of sleep deprivation and their cognitive performance through their GPA. And like I said, the significance of my study is that it fills in this gap that I just described, as all of the studies that I found in my own research were only for a single period of, for example, 26 hours, 48 hours, or along those lines, 1 night of sleep deprivation. And my study, like I said, covers multiple years of sleep deprivation. And it also fills the gap of literature as it relates to high school students. As I described, high school students and teenage age students are the group of people that are affected the most, yet I could not find any specific studies that particularly related directly to them. And also, like I said, it is very important because I described that sleep deprivation is a pandemic, especially among these teenage students, and my study relates to addressing this issue. For my methodology, I did a quantitative analysis, and some of the variables that I looked at were the amount of hours of sleep that the respondents got, as well as their GPAs, both unweighted and weighted. And surveys were a great way to do this, and through Google Forms, because surveys meant that I did not have to meet with and communicate with each participant individually, and I did not have to meet with them or require them to perform tasks multiple times over a period of time, which saved me and the participants a lot of time. And it meant that I did not have to obtain any special permissions. I could just use a one-time about survey that took respondents about 3 to 5 minutes, and that was all the data that I would need. And it was effective to use GPA because, as I described, GPA is cumulative of multiple years of work by the students, and it shows that, and it is shown that the sleep deprivation and the amount of hours of sleep that they got was cumulative over all the years rather than just over 1 night. So that is why this was effective in showing the relationship between the amount of sleep and the cognitive performance. And just some examples of the questions I asked were how many hours of sleep that each respondent got, their GPA, both weighted and unweighted, to gauge whether or not they took honors or AP classes, and then also their participation in an all-nighter, which I defined as having stayed up through the entire night, and then rather than going to sleep and waking up the next morning, when it was time to wake up the next morning, they were still awake and they just went on with their next day. The first graphic that I want to show is how many hours of sleep each participant got, and the percentage of them that received less than the recommended 8 hours of sleep. And this is just a baseline to show that there is a true problem in that more than the majority of students do not get enough sleep. And the next two graphics relate to the GPA, and it's GPA versus hours of sleep. The one on the left is unweighted GPA, and the one on the right is weighted GPA. And these two graphics are not very, you cannot really analyze them too deeply because it shows all of the points, but it does show the blue line, which is the line of best fit, is basically has no slope, and it's basically, there's a slope of 0. It just goes straight across the x-axis, and it's parallel to the x-axis, which kind of shows no, you could say it shows no correlation with these data points, but I think these graphics are important to look at because it shows the spread of the amount of hours of sleep as multiple participants reported receiving the same amount of hours of sleep, but there was varying amounts of GPAs in regards to each numerical value. And as you can see, there is an outlier of a student who responded that received 3 hours of sleep, but they still were able to maintain a relatively high GPA. So that is shown in a lot of the rest of the graphics, and it is accounted for in the averages for the students who receive less than 8 hours of sleep and students who receive more than 8 hours of sleep. And I thought this would be a better representation of the two groups of the students, with weighted GPA being red and blue being unweighted GPA, as I took the average GPA of the respondents who reported their numbers of sleep at each numerical value. So for example, the average amount of sleep at 5 hours, the average GPA at 5 hours of sleep, and then the 5.5 hours, 6 hours, and so on, up to 8. And the point at 8 includes all respondents who reported 8 or more hours. And as you can see, there is, because of that outlier at 3, it seems that it originally goes down, but once it hits 5 hours, 5.5 hours of sleep a night, it consistently rises, except for the specific point at 6.5 hours. And this shows that there is, even if it doesn't seem like there's much of a correlation, it shows that as with my data specifically, as the hours of sleep a night increased, the GPA, both weighted and unweighted, steadily increased as well. So this shows that they were almost directly related, as they both increased together. And these are the specific values for respondents who received less than 8 hours of sleep each night. The average unweighted GPA was 3.726, and the average weighted GPA was 3.955. And for those who received greater than 8 hours of sleep, the average unweighted GPA was 3.757, and the average weighted GPA was 3.968. And as you can see, both values increased, although it wasn't by much. They both did increase as the respondents who received greater than 8 hours on average had higher GPAs than those who received less than 8 hours of sleep each night. And this shows that and implicates that all the prior research and people who have said that you need 8 hours of sleep to perform better and you should get your 8 hours, although it may seem repetitive, is actually meaningful, and that this shows that getting greater than 8 hours of sleep results in greater cognitive performance. And some other interesting results that I found were how I asked about the all-nighters, which I already defined, and how about 57% of respondents said they had participated in an all-nighter, which is much more than the majority. And this speaks to the fact that many students throughout the nation, especially in an all-boys school. So as my respondents ranged from 14 to 18 in an all-boys school, an all-boys high school, and this can be looked at to the greater range of high school students throughout the nation, as it is very important to look at how many students participate in all-nighters, as the prior research that I described measured students and residents who had participated in all-nighters and how much of an impact it had on their cognitive performance. So that is why it is important to see, and it's concerning to see how many high school students perform all-nighters as well. And the other interesting result was that although the GPAs, average GPAs, both unweighted and weighted, of students who received less than 8 hours of sleep were less than the students who received more, a greater percentage of students who received less than 8 hours of sleep had taken at least one AP or honors class. So this is just interesting to see how one might conclude that students who get less than 8 hours of sleep, although their GPAs may be lower, it may be due to the fact that they are more dedicated to taking harder classes. So that is one interesting thing to take into account. And overall, I found, as I showed in this previous slide, it was found that there was a relationship found between the amount of hours of sleep each night and the GPA, the average GPA. And then this is also another graphic to show hours of sleep throughout the years of high school. And it just shows that as students progress in high school, they received less and less amounts of sleep, which speaks to, again, the difficulty of classes, as well as the fact that they may see sleep as less important in comparison to achieving the grades that they want. And for some future research, I suggest that periodic cognitive tests are used on students, as one of my limitations was that I did not perform specific tests, I just asked them their GPAs. And I think it would be important to include specific tests to see in the moment how students perform, rather than just as a GPA can be misleading. And also consideration of habits of the student respondents, as I described in the introduction. Things such as eating, electronics, and exercise, these can affect the hours of sleep that they get. Even if they get more than enough, this sleep could be low quality sleep. And also, one important thing that I have not yet described and explained is the sleep cycle. And I think it's important to analyze at what point in the sleep cycle students awaken, as according to Professor Jessica Payne of the University of Notre Dame, sleep happens in specific 90-minute cycles, and after a period of about 15 minutes, people enter deep sleep, and if they're awakened while they're in this deep sleep, which ends at around 90 minutes, then they're significantly more groggy and less capable of performing simple tasks. So I think it will be important to see at what point in these cycles that students awaken, and maybe correlate this to their cognitive performance as well, as it might be shown that those who sleep in these 90-minute cycles, such as 4.5 hours, 6 hours, 7.5 hours, and etc., may perform better. Thank you.
Terrific, thanks, Ethan. I've got 3 questions for you, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay, so for the first one, how did you review of the methods used by the scholars in your initial exploration? How did that review inform the method you were going to use? Tell us a little bit about that.
So in all the research that I used, the previous scholars, they all used certain methods of having their participants miss out on an extended period of one night of sleep deprivation, rather than, like, as my study was a longevity over time. And they then use they use certain tests on their respondents after these periods of sleep deprivation, and this led me to want to kind of fill in the gap that they had left by doing a study, like I said, that would have a factor of longevity, as GPA is shown to be cumulative of years and months if they were freshmen, but years, for most likely years of this sleep deprivation. So that informed me to want to kind of fill in what they had been missing.
Okay. And then as a follow-up to that, how do your findings specifically provide directions for future research? I know you had a future research slide, but what about your findings leads to that future research being necessary?
So My findings about how I did find a relationship between the average GPA being lower for students who received less than 8 hours of sleep, that led me to into the future research, as I think it is important to not only look at GPA, but maybe look at factors that may cause this GPA, and that may cause, like I said, students to sleep less. And I also think that it's important to look at these, like I said, the cycles, because this was kind of, I guess, it didn't go too deep into what caused the students to lose sleep. It just said how many hours of sleep and GPA. But I think it can go deeper to explore both of those variables and provide more meaningful connections.
And then the final question, what was the most important research skill that you either picked up or developed more fully as part of this whole process? And how do you think you could apply that skill in the future?
The most important skill that I picked up was being willing to be flexible, so flexibility, as a lot of things changed throughout my process. Originally, I wanted to do a series of tests, such as like cognitive tests in coordination with many adults in the community, such as the athletic trainer. But I realized that this would be very hard, as I would need to not only coordinate with him to get access to his room and test every time I wanted to test the respondents, but I would also have to be in contact with them, the respondents, constantly. So it showed me that I could be flexible by switching to a completely different method, but still being able to have effective results. So I think I can apply that beyond high school and into college and into the workforce.
Terrific.